So I wanted to carve out some time here real quick to talk about I don't want to call it unified theory of information because that's way too ambitious, but at least when it comes to your common base, maybe some of my latest thinking about the life cycle of information as it goes into, around, and back out of your system. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that I'm approaching the launch party for your common base, which is going to be set for the end of January. And I'm trying to gear myself up to both display the software in a production form, but also argue for its use. A lot of software needs to have a persuasive element to it because a data structure, in a way, is a way of putting your data that you can argue is more efficient than another way. Versus like a hash table or a tree or a regular flat array, these all have computational trade-offs, but they also have user trade-offs as well. And the thing that I optimize for with your common base is stress from the human in terms of being able to access the information that you want and do stuff with it. So this was actually the first version of what we'll be talking about here, so you can see a little bit spoiler of what we'll be talking about: external info, storing, and then there's a little guy there after organization, and then sharing. But I kind of nailed this into what I think is a multi-step process. I don't know how many steps, but this is kind of like the first start is external information. So external information is anything that is consumed from the world at large. This can literally be anything. This can be music that you hear walking down the street or at a cafe, a smell that you smelled seeing a deer outside of your window, a text message from a friend or a family member. Literally any stimulus that didn't originate from you, I qualify as this external information. And we'll revisit these blue things later, but we'll just kind of like start with the actual buckets themselves. Then we have thoughts, and thoughts are kind of, I was kind of going back and forth on whether I consider a thought internal or external, and that might sound silly because of course a thought is an internal process, but I don't really think it is. I think that there's actually a lot of categories of thoughts that are very heavily dependent off of external information and only exists because something is happening in the real world that like draws something into your thought process. So you might be reminded of something from the real world that gives you a thought, and the thing about thoughts is that they can inspire themselves. So you might think of a thought about something. How do I get rid of this? Oh my gosh. Okay, there we go. You might think a thought about something, and then that ropes around and creates another thought about that thing. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of concept, that thoughts themselves can kind of have this relationship where they bounce and bounce and bounce around, and then maybe this comes back over here, and then right? Again, get pretty complex. So, but I think thoughts are also before the system. Then over here, I have two parts. So I have this part here, which is the human, and this part here, which is the filter. So basically, the idea is that you are a human and you filter information that goes into your system. Not everything is worth keeping, and I think that this is one of the things that people thought was really creepy about Microsoft Recall, for example, was that it just kept everything. Like, it had no approval. You can kind of think of this as a toll road. Like, you want to say, like, okay, this information is worth keeping in some shape or form, or at least I decide that it's worth indexing. So the system shouldn't automatically index things unless you give it permission to index something automatically. So from here on out, we're going to be talking about things that are in the system of YCB. Importantly to note, this is about companion. The core YCB functions actually there's only really two. You have your search function, which allows you to do semantic search and full text search, and adding. And it's really interesting because there are extra API functions that are written onto companion, particularly like random and fetch and inbox, and kind of like a few API endpoints for handling the entry comment model, but really, again, the core functions are just search and add, and you can build anything on top of those two things. Not anything, but you can build a lot of things that require searching and adding of data, right? So the first thing that happens in a common base is actually a self-organization layer. So the system itself will organize the data into some shape by assigning it a vector. You can also change the metadata here. So you might have a metadata that tags it as something, or sort it by dates. These are all automatic things that the human doesn't really have to do. All you have to do is you have to pass in that external information to the system, or write down a thought like, today I was eating cranberries, into your system, right? And that organization comes for free. So that's a free organization. So then we have a number of functions, and this is actually, I think, where some of the confusion lies in terms of where I've been trying to give what your common base does a narrative that I think other people can kind of get behind, is that there's actually a lot of functions that you can do inside of the system. So you can share, which we'll talk about last actually, you can search, you can scout, and you can synthesize. So in my mind, sharing, or actually let's start over with search. So in my mind, searching is the most obvious, right? You're looking for something specific. So you're saying like, I'm looking for XYZ, over here, and that's what you're going to be searching for. A search is like, I'm looking for this thing and I want to find this thing, and to do that we use semantic search and we used full text search to find what we're looking for. Over here we have scouting. Scouting is a little bit different. Scouting is kind of not looking for anything in particular, but you'll know something that's useful when you found it. The way I think of scouting is kind of like that game Hot and Cold, where the idea is that you kind of look at some information and it basically is on a trigger in your head where it's like you want to continue to pursue it or you want to go away from it. And if you want to continue to pursue it, you're going to want to go over here to like this area. But if you want to move away from it, you actually want to be over here in this area. So you kind of just know which direction you want to go in with scouting. And I think scouting is possible in the system. And again, we'll talk about all the functions afterwards. Next up is synthesize. So the way I see synthesis is kind of like taking something that already exists that was automatically organized by the system and then adding an extra layer of information to it that gives it another piece of information. So there's a lot of things that this can be. This can be internal links, this can be comments. Again, I'll talk about these in a minute. But synthesize largely is kind of saying like, here was my information before, and then here is what it is afterwards. That looks kind of the same, but maybe I'll put like a square inside of it or something. You basically just change the information into something else. And that's what synthesis is. And sometimes synthesis is actually connecting two ideas. So you might have an idea over here, and then you might have an idea over here, and you might have an idea over here, and then synthesis is connecting these two ideas to each other, right? So like some kind of link. Then finally you have sharing, and sharing is basically taking the work that you've done in your system and putting it back out into the external world. So you take something that's interesting and then you reshare it, and it becomes external information for somebody else. In a way, this video is that. So actually I can show you exactly where this video fits into this pipeline. So a lot of this comes from my thoughts, right? Like I basically came up with this frameworks, but these thoughts were inspired by, oh my God, this is so annoying when it does this. Okay, cool. Were inspired by external information, right? Like me having journaled before and used software like Notion and Obsidian and just being familiar with how personal knowledge management works has inspired certain thoughts. And then these thoughts have inspired new external information and yada, yada. And then I basically took them into my system, let's say. And now what I'm doing largely while filming this video is synthesizing. So I'm taking that information that I stored before in my own head and I'm synthesizing it into a version that I can share back out to the audience. So synthesis and sharing is really the two kind of functions that are like largely happening under the hood here. And then scouting is kind of, again, like broad exploration, and searching is looking for something in particular. So, which aren't happening much in this video, but I guess if you found this video, if you probably either searched for it or you scouted for it. So you are doing these two things. So you're saying, oh, I was looking directly for more information on YCB, or I just happened to stumble across this, which is scouting. So let's go back to where we started, which was search, and let's look at the external information and talk about the blue thing. So you can see here that I have iOS, Chrome, etc. Basically what this means is that there's an iOS shortcut, there is a Chrome extension, and there's like Alfred and Readwise and Obsidian plugins and Google Doc plugins. These are basically things that you can consider upstream that you can use the /add function over here to add to your system. Then we have the flow state. So basically flow state is something that I came up with that is a text box, like a journal, but it has a special button down here that's called like a plus search button. So basically what the plus search button does is it loads in entries of the search matches under your thing. So what's interesting is, like, let's say that you're saying like, waffle or something like that, right? It'll add waffle to your system whenever you hit that add button, but then it'll also return pancakes and blueberries or whatever, right? Is that semantically matches in your system. And the reason that this is useful is that you can actually say, oh, actually add waffle to this too, and add waffle to this too. So basically in the graph, we're now creating a link between all three of these three things. And I know it's hard to see because they're just kind of random lines, but it is what it is, right? So going back down here to search. So there's multiple ways to search for something directly. Of course, you can just go directly, number one, with the search modal, which is basically saying I'm looking for something in particular and I know what I'm looking for. Garden is basically saying I'm searching and I know that it was on this day. I know it was on Monday, September 5th. So you can kind of go to the garden view and see exactly what happened on that day and the entries that were saved. The log is kind of the same thing as garden, but it's the opposite, where it's saying I know that I added it in the last 10 entries or updated this entry less than 10 entries ago. So let me go to the log and see the latest entries that I updated. And then the inbox is saying, I know that I added this, but I never actually added a comment to it. So let me go and look for it and then kind of do that. So Scout, as you'll notice, is really similar. We have a lot of things that are basically the same here. We have garden, we have inbox. You could also probably put log over here if you want to, but there's a few other things. So we have graph, and technically what we mean by graph is actually graph expansion. So if I'm starting here and then I'm connected to this node here, I can optionally add an expansion that expands out and finds these two new nodes. So these two over here were actually added through an expansion. And that was expanded because we were like, let's just go this direction, right? Like, and keep going. Then flow state, which we introduced above, is actually a really great scouting tool because it serves as, again, like I said, a search and an add. So if you just write whatever is on the top of your head, it'll just show you search results. And these search results will kind of help you kind of inspire new thinking. And both of them have a button called add to or open in companion, so you can press the open in companion button and it'll actually send you to that one's graph, so you can start there. Next we have a random button, which basically just returns a random entry in your common base. This is super useful, and I think that it's largely slept on in the physical medium of paper, of just opening to a random page and just going from there. But I think that, again, that's a shortcoming of kind of how analog does things. But it's way easier to do with digital when you have a database. You can literally just say math.random. Then, we have garden and inbox, which again I've already said, but this time, instead of looking for something particular, you're basically just saying, take me to a random day and let's go for it, or let's just run randomly through the inbox and not try and, start it necessarily like 0, 1, 2. You just kind of like look through it and see what interests you. Over here in synthesize, there's only really two things that I wanted to talk about. These aren't the inclusive two things, but I think that these two things are true for synthesis, especially with companion and your common base, so they're worth talking about. Number one is comments. So an entry is kind of like saying, again, like IHOP breakfast or whatever, and then a comment, so anything that's going to be connected to this entry will be like pancakes, like fucking blueberries, waffles, right? Like, these are its neighbors. But let's say that you wanted to connect something like Vincent van Gogh, or something completely unrelated. What you do is you leave a comment, and this comment over here says like, reminds me of Starry Night eating at IHOP, or maybe they have a picture of Starry Night, and then it's going to be connected to Van Gogh. So now all of a sudden we established a relationship between Van Gogh, Starry Night, and IHOP. So this was our original node, and then we went to Starry Night, and then we went up to Van Gogh. So you can't do that without a comment. This thing is never going to reach this thing directly. That's not how it works, or semantic search works. But you can with a comment. Next, we have a wiki link. So a wiki link is basically an internal link inside of something. You can kind of think of it as like an underline. So if I have like, like yo, mama, I can wiki link mama here, and that will actually, that's like, let me switch over to this thing real quick and make it green. Maybe that'll make it easier. So if I go to let's say the Matrix or something like that, this will return everything that's related to the Matrix. But if I just wiki link Matrix with 2 square brackets here, this will return different things. And the reasoning for that is that this is technically a different search than this one, right? Because this is like searching the whole thing, and this is only searching partially. So you can think of this as like a substring search, and this is actually really useful because it shows you different parts of your graph without having to add data or add a new comment, you know what I mean? New comment. So that's like pretty useful, I think, overall. I wonder how I can, let's see, object eraser. Yeah, let's do that. Let's get rid of this. We don't need any of this. And then finally, we have share. So share is basically just, again, a way to take what you've already said in your graph. So let's say that you have this graph here. I'll break out this eraser one more time, or this pen. And this is your graph that you have, and maybe you have an expansion over here, and you have an internal link over here, and you have a comment in your base entry. What you can do is you can hit this share button, and this will turn this into a link. So ID under your username. So it'll be like, Bram ID. And then basically, if I visit, over here in the future as external information, if I visit that /Bram/ID, I get that link to that graph, which makes it like kind of, in my mind, at least full circle. I think that it wasn't really convincingly full circle to me until I figured out some kind of way to connect what was happening inside the system here, because like this is all inside the system with stuff that happens outside of the system. I'll get rid of this. Okay. So anyway, kind of scuffed, but this was a overall kind of look into how the whole system works. So just to go over it again really quickly in summation, you have external information from anything in the world. That can be literally anything from that's like a visible, audible stimulus. Then you have your thoughts about those stimuluses, but you can also have thoughts about thoughts. Then you have what's actually in your common base. So this was all stuff that you filtered into your common base, depending on how you decided it. Your common base automatically organizes things for you, so you don't have to do this step. But anything below this is something that involves human engagement, because it doesn't like just kind of do things itself. But you can search for stuff, which is like, okay, I'm looking for this exact thing. You can scout for stuff, which is like, I'm just kind of browsing and exploring the space. You can synthesize, which is making new connections through your own personal ontology, which is very powerful. This of the three is definitely probably the most powerful function that you can be spending your time doing in your system. And then finally, you have sharing, which is relatively self-explanatory because we live in an era of social media, but it's basically just sharing your knowledge back out into the overall world. So that's it. Thanks for watching.